Welcome to Podcast 83, a regular look at the news, stories, and trends related to Michigan's 83 counties from the Michigan Association of Counties.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Podcast 83, the podcast put on by the Michigan Association of Counties. As we start to move towards the end of the year here and moving through lame duck session, we of course have our legislative team, Deena Bosworth, Madeline, Fata, and Samantha Gibson. So we had a week of lame duck last week. What happened? What didn't happen? Some things happened we've never seen before. So feel free to talk amongst yourselves.
We had a week of chaos. Chaos. Would you call it
True.
chaos, Sam? I would call it a little
I would. I think I've lost all concept of time after the way last week went.
It was long. So what we saw, a little bit of geeky stuff, and then we'll kind of laugh a little bit about how chaotic it was. But in order to get bills through the legislative process, they have to be in each legislative chamber for 5 days at a minimum. At a minimum. So we saw last week the Senate stay in until they started at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, and they adjourned sometime around 5:30 a.m. on Friday morning. And they did that so that they could pass out all of their first House bills, so the Senate bills. Because those Senate bills would have to be in the passed over to the House and be in the House for 5 days before the House could act on them. Now we're not sure. We think legislative session is going to be done on the 18th or on the 19th. On Thursday would be the last legislative day. So they needed to get those across the chamber or building. I'm going to get it. I'm a little tired, still sleep deprived. Same with the House. The House was in on Friday morning. They started at 9 a.m. and adjourned sometime around 10:30 p.m. just to try and move all their House bills over. So that's the facts of it. But wow, was it a whirlwind? A whirlwind of bills.
And a caveat to that is technically if there's a legislative session Monday, bills could still be acted on this week and still switch chambers if they were to meet Monday. So
Can somebody put soap in his mouth?
Yeah, well,
I don't want to be in. Yeah, okay.
There were discussions about it at one point. We're not hearing much of that anymore right now, but that was discussed as well. But to your point, I think on Friday night, the House adjourned a little earlier than they were expecting to, right? Why?
Because they had certain members who were absolutely not happy with what was happening. No, wait, back up.
Start at Friday morning.
Start Friday morning. Yeah. Well, you tell this one, Madeline. I've talked enough. You tell this story.
Friday morning, yes, a few members were unhappy. An entire caucus walked out of the chambers. The Republicans all walked out in protest because it had been made clear that there wouldn't be a compromise on the tipped wage fix. So they all stormed out. So it was just the Democrats left in the chambers for about 11 of those 13 hours of the session day.
So that was immediately 54 members that were no longer in the chamber. So you're left with 56, right?
All Democrats, all one party. The Republicans walked out because there was no deal, and they said they would come back. They stayed around town. Said they would come back and vote if they were willing to put up the fix for the tipped wage and they're in sick time, but it never happened. So yeah, they continued on. Go ahead,
Right.
Matt.
Well, you need 56 votes to pass a bill. No matter who's in the majority, you need 56 votes. So you had to hold a caucus together there. So we're progressing through the day at a very slow pace, let's just say, on passage of bills. And then what happens?
And then they start passing things, and the communication was pretty rough, but it was just the Democrats all voting the same way. They put up, one bill that one of the Democrats voted no on, so they had to take it down. And then later, they had a couple of members that say, you know what, you're not doing what I really wanted you to do. This is crazy business. We're done. And they decided they were leaving. And if even one member of the Democratic one member of the Democratic caucus walked out, they wouldn't have enough votes. They wouldn't have the majority votes that they needed. And there was a member that said, I'm done. I'm leaving.
So that's how session ended Friday night at 10:30.
Mhm.
So here we are now, early in the week on the following week, or Monday afternoon. This will probably go out Tuesday. And now what are we expecting for the rest of session? We don't really know much, or we know a little bit, but who knows who's going to show up? Are Republicans going to come back in and vote? It's sounding like they're not going to on Wednesday. Tuesday, the Capitol is shut down anyway, so there was no session. Anyway, so the first day of session this week was going to be Wednesday. It sounds like the Republicans are not going to come back in and vote, and we're not sure about the Democratic caucus at this point, correct?
Yeah, we don't know. This puts so much up in the air. Yeah, we don't know if the Democrats are gonna have their majority members there. I mean, maybe the Republicans will change their mind. I think if Speaker Tate says, well, there's not really much he could do. I don't think there's any vehicles to fix the tipped wage issue. I don't think there is. So I don't see why the Republicans would come back. I think Democrats missed their window on having bipartisan legislation move through. But
Unless
yeah.
they were to, unless they were to come back the 23rd,
Oh, I hate you.
right?
Yes, yes, unless they come back on the 23rd, which is not unprecedented. It's happened before where they came in right before Christmas. I think they were here on Christmas Eve. And Steve, you were telling a story about it earlier that you were talking to some of the old guard who were here when that happened. So it could happen again. I'm not saying that it won't. I doubt it. I think with as disgruntled as the Democratic caucus is at this point in the House and the attendance problems that they've been plagued with all year, I find it highly unlikely, but it is possible. It is possible because if the House moved something, it's the Senate that would have to take up the bill on the 23rd. And so then if they don't make any changes to it, it can automatically get enrolled and go to the governor. If there are no changes, but if the House isn't here to do concurrence votes to any changes, it won't happen.
Right, and that means a lot of bills could just die without any action on them at this point that could have been passed by the one chamber. Like you said, the Senate's still in. They were still expecting them to be here Wednesday, Thursday of this week to do whatever work they can do. But one last point on all this that happened last week and even this week, was starting to read some articles about it. I've never seen such public venting of frustration before that I've seen with what happened last week. I think most of the time that happens privately within the caucus, but man, there's some social media posts and things like that out there that are pretty critical of the speaker. That's kind of unprecedented, I think.
Yeah, I think you do see some disgruntled behavior. We see more of it in Lansing, but this is very public. This is on X. This is, interviews that are being done. And right or wrong, whether their opinion is valid, not valid, that's not up for me to decide. I am not a member of that caucus. But I will say I agree with you, Steve. I've never seen it so public.
Yeah. Usually it's handled a little more privately. So that being said, let's talk a little bit about legislation we're still working on, tracking movement. Of course, what we always bring up first, revenue sharing trust fund, still sitting in committee in the Senate. Of course, at this point, we would expect it, if we were going to get movement on it, it would need to be discharged. It would have to be voted on in the Senate, which we would expect to have the votes, to be honest, but would need a concurrence vote if it was changed in the Senate at this point. If it stays the same, we wouldn't need any concurrence vote, correct, Deena?
Yes, but this is the problem. If we don't change it, if we can get the bills moving, but we don't change it, then we're asking for less revenue sharing next year than we got this year. That percentage would need to change in order to reflect this current year's appropriation. Now, would we rather have the trust fund and then fight for more money to get back up there in the next budget cycle? For sure. We want to secure as much money as we can in that account so that that's not taken away from us in the future, and then we can advocate for more. But if they do make the changes, then yes. If by chance we get the Senate to discharge the bills out of committee, take them up for a vote on the Senate floor, pass them over to the House, we would still need the House to concur in the changes and then send those bills to the governor. We're still struggling to get the bills even discharged out of committee. And every possible effort I mean, it's just all of our efforts, ours, municipal league, the townships, we're doing everything we possibly can to get those bills moving in the Senate. And it's been extremely hard to get any commitment from Senate leadership to do it.
So what's our latest move to kind of jar that loose?
So today, every single senator is getting a letter that says, hey, revenue sharing trust fund is extremely important to locals. And attached to that letter is the name and title of every single letter of support we got sent in to us from our members, MML members, MTA members, where we held the press conference, SEMCOG members, and we had over 500 of them. So all of their names are attached. These are the local leaders who are in favor of having this revenue sharing trust fund done. What are you doing about it? So we'll see. That goes out to them, I think, today.
Great. So that'll draw some attention to that. Moving along, we sent out an update last week and I think a call to action last week on this piece of legislation that has to do with the minimum staffing levels. Sam, can you give us an update on where that legislation stands now?
Thank you, Steve. The House version of minimum staffing legislation, it appears to be dead. It's still a first chamber bill. That said, it wouldn't be lame duck without a last minute bill introduction and a hurry to get it out of a chamber. So last week, Senate Bill 1167 was passed out of the Senate. It did have an amendment. It states that if revenue sharing or property tax values decrease from the previous fiscal year, then a local unit of government would not have to comply with minimum staffing as a mandatory subject of bargaining. I see what legislators were attempting to do with that. However, it really doesn't solve the problem. So we did have to reject that. I feel fairly confident that this is in a good place in the House and that our opposition is strong and it's heard amongst House Democrats, especially with them being forced to get to 56 votes at this point to get anything done. That said, I do want to stress the importance to our membership that you talk to your legislators, particularly those of you that have House Democrats as your representatives. Talk to them and let them know how detrimental Senate Bill 1167 will be to you all. And emphasize that we are already short-staffed in our jails and our sheriff's departments, and that this is not the solution. This will only make it worse.
And, you know, potentially more costly, right? I mean, that's really what our focus of our opposition is on that. And, you know, we saw a lot of legislation move that could cost us, and we're not going to talk about it all today, but they've all been in our updates that hit the expense side of the balance sheet. But the one piece that could have really helped on the revenue side, the revenue sharing trust fund, we saw no movement on. Madeline, septic code, saw again a lot of changes in some legislation late in the game last week. Can you tell us where the septic code legislation is?
Yes. So last Wednesday, I believe it was, there was a new draft of the statewide septic code brought before the Senate Natural Resources Committee. And this version is significantly better than any version we've seen to date. It is extremely watered down. What it actually does is it says that septic tanks that fall within a high risk zone, which means close to bodies of water, close to 100-year floodplains, there's a little criteria for that. Those tanks will need to be inspected one time. And there is no mandate that they need to be inspected again after any period of time. It also leaves the point of sale ordinances as is. Locals can continue utilizing that tool. So we are very happy with the progress we made with the bill sponsor. He was excellent. He was very attentive to our needs, to the needs of public health. And that bill did ultimately pass the Senate last week, so it is on the House floor most likely this week. But yeah, I feel pretty good about where we landed with that.
And the House bills, which were significantly different than the Senate bills, they didn't move, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so
Yep.
So essentially, like we talked about with the timing, they would be first chamber bills. We did not expect them to have movement on that.
Yeah,
Uh,
I gotta say, Madeline, that was amazing though, because when those bills were first introduced, that was very onerous. I mean, they wanted, just the crazy amount of septic tanks inspected each and every year that just really could never work for our membership. We couldn't get to them all.
Yeah, we
So-
went from every single septic tank in the state of Michigan needing to be inspected every 5 years to just those high risk tanks needing one inspection right in
And,
like a 10-year window. So yeah, I think it came a long way.
and you were able to maintain local control with the point of sale ordinance. So nice work. Nice
Yeah,
work.
definitely. And I think that point of sale ordinance is important too, because I know there's a fair amount of not just counties, but local units that use that and have found that to be a good way to kind of at least keep tabs on where a lot of these septic issues are. And then finally, a piece of legislation that we were not aware about, we're not consulted about, but did get a vote out of committee and then on the House floor, has to deal with how county commission districts are apportioned. Deena, I think kind of you and Madeline both were working on this one a little bit. Tell us a little bit about that piece of legislation.
Yeah, so it's House Bill 6171, and it was introduced by Representative Phil Skaggs. It redoes the apportionment process. Initially, when it was introduced, he took that 5-member board and he took the county prosecutor and the county treasurer out of the drawing of those districts and was going to fill those seats with members of the major political parties within the county and have those seats redrawn. There is a formula for how the seats are to be drawn. I'm sorry, he put them back in the bill before it passed out of the House, but there's a formula for how the seats have to be drawn, and it's not necessarily based on the closest population, but you have to take into account where the political parties are and the strength of it. So the whole goal, from what I understand, the whole goal of this legislation is to take a board that is, let's say, 100% Republican and you recognize that 30% of the people who live in that county are Democrats, maybe they should have some representation on the county board as well. Now, how this actually works, we're not quite sure. We're trying to get some experts to explain to us what that's gonna look like or how that process would work. But since we were not consulted at all, in the drafting of this legislation, we're really struggling to understand why he's doing this without county commissioner input.
Clerks or treasurers or really any county elected officials that may be involved in this process previously. So I think it's something we're still trying to wrap our arms around, and hopefully we'll get some feedback here this week and we can share it once we have it. But something to definitely watch. Again, what was that bill number? Do you have it in front of you, Deena?
6171.
Yeah, House Bill 6171, which is in the Senate now. So
Madeline, did you have anything to add? I know you paid a little bit more, you were closer to it than I was. Anything?
Just that, yeah, as Steve said, county commissioners were going to be hugely impacted. County clerks would be impacted, treasurers, prosecutors, and not a single one of our entities was consulted prior to introduction, as far as I know. And MAC has long opposed changing the way in which county commissioner districts are drawn. So we did submit a card of opposition to the legislation before even fully understanding it based on that one principle. And they're changing population thresholds for the sizes of boards, which means like Macomb County specifically under this legislation would need 2 additional county commissioners on their board. That's huge. And yeah, absolutely not a call before it. So
And we don't know if it's good or bad. We don't really know. We need time to do an analysis on it. So I'm not happy that this is happening in Lame Duck.
Yeah, it seems like something that would have been better done, thought out, bring in key stakeholders, let's see what it means, then get the groups to come on board, that sort of thing. But obviously that didn't happen. All right. Well, another week. We'll see what happens. We do expect to do another podcast recapping the final week, either later this week or early next week. So stay tuned, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Podcast 83.